Hi everyone, this is Tori. Thanks for joining me for my discussion of my 2 March of the Mammoths. A mammoth is a book that is more than 800 pages, and I miraculously managed to read 2 of them this month. I also wanted to note that I did change the title of my channel because somebody else already was using Fully Booked for booktube. I am now Read Demon, so kind of the play on words with Speed Demon. Friends always tell me that I read really fast, and then stylistic choice to use the spelling of demon that is used in the His Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman, which was a childhood favorite of mine. So in that book, demons are more like half of you, sort of your spirit entity that manifests as an animal. And definitely if I had a demon, I imagine like Lyra, I would have some kind of weasel. It's my dad's nickname for me when I was growing up, Weasel. So yeah, Read Demon, welcome to the new channel. And like I said, today I'm going to be talking about my mammoths that I read for the month of March. So the first book that I read for March of the Mammoths was Mists of Avalon, which, as I noted, was a reread of a childhood book for me. It is an extremely long book from the 80s that's sort of recasting the Arthurian myth with women at the center. I can definitely see why I liked this book and like how books like it shaped what I like to read. It has incredibly deep character development and pretty descriptive use of goddess worship culture, which is something that is definitely of interest to me in terms of paganism. So definitely can see what I liked about it. I also, oh my god, can't believe how much talking and thinking there is in this book. A lot of people on Goodreads complained about that because it's, you know, during Arthurian times or theoretical Arthurian times, if it is in fact historical. Women are not, you know, given a whole lot of freedom to do more of the action. And so that is seen as sort of the downfall of the books to many. I think it really does give you so much internal characterization of the characters, but it also does make it move slow. I'd say the last quarter of this book was really starting to slog for me. So, content warning for discussion of sexual violence. The reason that I read this book again primarily was this sort of central question of like, can you see the monstrousness of the person who wrote this book, who's sexually abused her own children, in the text. And, you know, I'll get into some detail of like how it was or wasn't that apparent, but I just want to comment on the actual question itself. So like the central question of whether you can see it coming, sort of someone's bad behavior in earlier work of theirs is, I think, speaking to a central illusion of control that many of us seek. Like the whole, you have to be able to tell that the serial killer was dangerous, you had to be able to see the signs, or I think to some extent this speaks to like why women are some of the most voracious content devourers of true crime stories. You know, there's like this belief that we can protect ourselves if we have the information of how to avoid something, that I think is not dissimilar to sort of the quest to uncover an abuser's monstrousness in their work. I think you see that a lot with Woody Allen, and like, you know, references to the plots of at least one of his films. So, you know, just want to caveat, you can't control things, you can't anticipate or see coming necessarily abuse or violence against marginalized people or women. Like, let's not pretend we can. But I still, you know, think it's worthwhile to examine a text that was formative for me to see if there were really troublesome narratives happening there. And, you know, I really gotta say I couldn't really see it really clearly in the narrative. There's a troubling moment that I think a lot of reviewers note where it's Beltane and like the fertility ritual is going on, and a young girl like struggles against rape, you know, a man trying to be sexual with her, and it's a troubling moment, but I don't think the text inherently apologizes for it or like makes it seem like it's okay behavior necessarily. It's like a night of the year that doesn't have rules, and it's very much like attributed to the religion. And so, you know, that's like the most obvious moment at which you might see some of the disturbing thoughts that Bradley clearly held. There are other sort of like aside moments that, when I know what I'm looking for, made me uncomfortable. There's a general sense of ease of like with sexual relationships between what are essentially children and old men that are uncomfortable, and some references to characters referencing Greek style love, which is like overtly about homosexuality, but like knowing that the background of that is like young boys with men, and also knowing that Bradley was married to someone and like defended that type of relationship in like her scholarship, that makes it really uncomfortable to read that. But I think given like what's going on in the book and the, again, historical maybe background, it's not surprising to see, you know, those kinds of relationships going on and being normalized, because they were often normal in those times. So that doesn't like totally let it off the hook. You know, I think even in well-established mythology, we still have the ability in fantasy literature to make things less problematic than they are in history. But you know, this book is really entrenched in that historical fiction. So again, if you know the backstory of the monstrousness of the person writing this book, there are plenty of places to feel uncomfortable, but it's not overt in the text, like we should have seen this coming type of thing. You know, there's a little bit of a subtler cast to the issue that I think is happening in the text, though. So at first, when I was reading Goodreads reviews of this book, I was kind of rolling my eyes at people being like, oh, she's so anti-Christian, I can't handle, you know, how one-sided this is. And I'm just like, Christianity is certainly not the marginalized institution here, right? Like, we don't need to be protecting Christianity's feelings. But I will say that the pedestal that Bradley puts goddess worship and this brand of paganism, which also is not, we don't know what kind of paganism and goddess worship was really being practiced, what the rules were, right? But the way that Bradley casts this as like this sort of untouchable, wonderful religion, in contrast with the Christians, who are not very redeemable, like very much the reason for Guinevere's internalized misogyny, and like peddling viewpoints that are disempowering to women and beyond, as we know. When you make all the Christians irredeemable fools, it's hard to take any criticism of the goddess worshippers seriously. And so that in and of itself kind of creates a dynamic where you can't condemn anything they do because there's no like alternative that is contrasted in a serious way. I'm kind of like maybe babbling a little bit here, but basically that above condemnation status that is bestowed on the goddess culture creates a dynamic where there's things that they do that are terrible are being excused. Vivian's web of machinations. Like, I feel like we're supposed to just accept that that was all, it all had to happen for a reason. The goddess is above us. But, like, it's legitimately fucked up that Vivian tricked her, I guess her niece and nephew into sleeping together and conceiving a child. Like, that's not okay. And the way that Morgaine comes to have this complicated love for her brother is both very human, given the position that she was put in. And also, if you, in the nuance, you can see how it excuses the initial behavior that was absolutely not okay for her to be in this position and accept that these things had to happen. So, I'm going to go on to talk about how some of that characterization was very well done, but I think even though the problem isn't super clear in the text, if you dig a little deeper, you can see how Bradley's viewpoint is inherently not great, and is in line with some of the behavior that she would exhibit towards her children, which is very upsetting. So at this point, we can move on from this like really deep, dark conversation around sexual violence and how it does or doesn't show up in this book. There are other ways that it shows up that I'm not even getting into, but moving on to some of the other things I noticed about this book. I think the next thing that I wanted to talk about is just a lot of like the discussion of this book centers around whether it's a feminist text. What does it mean for a book to be feminist really? Is it just about the centrality of the female characters? Is there more to it? I think one thing that seems meaningful to me is like whether the women in the story have agency over their lives, which is a completely different metric, right? So I think a lot of this discussion around the Mists of Avalon has died down since the revelation about Bradley's sexual violence came to light. But that is definitely something that I was thinking about while I was reading the book. And I think I would call it a feminist book because you see the women standing up for themselves. You see them in a much deeper way than I'm not saying Arthurian legend is like really has, in the general source text, has like a lot of character development in general, but I would say that the men are given a lot more space and time and attention than the women. And so having that space be devoted to the women characters, having them have very deep characterization, very human motivations, goes a long way. I think one of the things this book spends a lot of time with is the decisions that the women characters make, like all of the things that Morgan Le Fay does in the source material. It's just sort of like presented without reason. Like, why does she want to make her brother's life hell? We don't know. Why is she just this evil witch plotting? spending a lot of time unpacking those and making them seem like rational decisions made out of self-interest. Even things like tricking Lancelot into marrying Elaine are very much predicated on the desire to not ruin Guinevere and Arthur's reputation. And why does Arthur let Guinevere continue her romance with Lancelot? I think even that is clear a little bit more from everyone's perspective. So yeah, I think there's some feminism inherent in making sort of cartoon villain choices more rational and understandable, and coming from women who have motivations that make sense to us, as opposed to a lot of the texts that currently exists around the mythology, this story. Also, like Guinevere, right? I don't love this Guinevere. She's really annoying. But I see from her internal dialogue why she is the way she is, where her fears come from, and her the way that she's been so disempowered by the religion that she was raised in. So I think those things are feminist choices. The other thing that Bradley does, I think, is cheating a little bit. Like, some of the worst of the witch, evil witch tropes are not erased in this story. They're just conveniently shuffled off to another character. So instead of Morgan Le Fay or Morgaine being the one who's kind of doing some of the nastier stuff, like practicing sorcery with no ethical considerations, or blood sacrifice, or even sleeping around without really thinking about other people, those all go to Morgaine's aunt. So she takes the brunt of some of those more stereotypical witch, bad woman characteristics, instead of them being kind of just let go of in this narrative. So I feel like it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. The other thing that troubles me in terms of whether this is a feminist book is just how little agency any of the women in this story have. I think she does as much as she can with it, while maintaining this very narrow focus on the Arthurian story we have, the theoretical history of the time period, the context. Women often did not have a lot of control over their lives. They were being, all of their needs and wants were secondary to sort of what their family needed or what their husband wanted. And so I think, as much as fantasy should always be a place where we can let go of some of that, even when it's got some history, I think I see that Mists of Avalon is very much trying to stay in that historical lane and maintain some of that time period context. So, and there's some ways where this is an improvement. You see Igraine ready to hit back when her husband is treating her poorly, and being willing to leave, those types of things. But in general, there's not a lot of agency for any of these characters. Even King Arthur, right? He's very trapped by circumstance and what he needs to be for this kingdom. So yeah, that's just one way of looking at whether something is feminist. And I think this checks a lot of those boxes. So I think this was a good project for me, this reread of getting some closure on it's irrational to think that I should have been able to see that Bradley was a terrible person based on reading this book. Nobody could have seen that coming. Grateful to her daughter for being brave enough to step up and discuss those terrible experiences. And I think also the other aspect of the closure is like, there's a reason that I liked this book, right? There's some really deep character development here. There's empowerment of women insofar as the Arthurian context allows for it, and you know, it was the 80s, and the pagan world building is like pretty impressive. So I'm not going to be recommending this book to folks who are interested in Arthurian legend anymore. I'm looking for other books like this that do not come with the baggage of this author. A couple friends have recommended Legendborn to me, so I'm definitely going to move that up my list after reading this. But I would love to hear from you, like, what other interesting twists on the Arthurian legend have you found meaningful? Somebody else recommended Mythago Wood to me, so I'm probably going to check that out. I also love other Arthurian stuff. I love is the Lost Years of Merlin series. That really was the series that started it all for me in terms of Arthurian myth, even though, like, I really do. Merlin is my jam. I'm also going to check out some of the Mary Stuart books. I think that's her name, Merlin's Cave. But feel free to drop your recommendations in the comments. Okay, that's it for Mists of Avalon. So the second mammoth that I read this month was the Ambergris omnibus edition from Jeff Vandermeer, and wow, this book was a lot. So I'd say the thing that I took away the most from this book is just how intensely it's playing with form. I'd call it experimental, but it's probably more accessible than Vandermeer's other novels, which lean really heavily into that new weird subgenre. Vandermeer calls his style cross-pollination of like a form and genre and technique, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think it's a really apt metaphor for somebody who spends so much time with the chaos of the natural world and the beauty of that, and also the horror of that for humans. I would call this book very metatextual. It's constantly referring to itself. There's a lot of opportunity to like go back and forth between the stories and see how they're referencing each other, and a version of the author even shows up in one of the stories. So if you don't like meta, maybe not for you. This book goes from tourist brochure to like history book style, complete with footnotes, to art criticism, to memoir. There's just a lot of different styles of writing going on here, depending on who's narrating. It's a 3-part book. So there's, the first book is called City of Saints and Madmen, which was the first one published, and actually earlier than anything else. That one is more like short stories or maybe novellas. Then there's Shriek, which is the most self-referential and is narrated by 2 main characters in the story, Duncan Shriek and his sister. And then the third book is Finch, and that is more of like a noir novel. It's very different in tone than the other 2 books, and I wasn't a huge fan of like the style, but it did, insofar as anything is going to answer your questions about what the hell is going on in this book. It's really important to read the 3rd book to get those answers, because that's mostly where they are. One thing I would say about the experience of reading this book is, if you are interested in it, keep reading for a little while. The first novella of the first book is called Drayden in Love, and while the prose was amazing, I found the characters so unlikable and like grotesque that I like almost put this book down after the first story. Just kind of like, I don't know if I can handle this right now. But I really became invested after that. I think it's also the first story was just like, there's a lot of new concepts, a lot of things going on, and I'm like, what's happening? So glad that I continued. My favorite character of these books is Martin Lake, who appears pretty heavily, I think, in the first book. So there was a lot to like there once I got past that beginning. Other things that I really liked about this book were the inventiveness and sort of unique world building that includes a lot of mycology, or like mushroom life forms. Those are the gray caps are definitely like the central mystery. What's up with them? What do they want? How do they live their lives? I think that was really interesting to me, and by extension, all of the other mushrooms that they kind of like farm or are keeping for mysterious purposes around the city. I also really appreciated that there was some direct examination of the concept of colonization going on here, mostly in the historical material about how Ambergris was settled, and how that is depicted as horrific, and how it has a continued impact on the city as it continues, to grow and change. So those were some of my favorite things about the book. There is so much layered detail in this book. It sometimes becomes overwhelming because a lot of it's important, but a lot of it's not. So I was trying to track down like this minor character, where do they appear again? How are they connected to this other story? It was a lot to track. But if you like puzzles, if you like the mystery, definitely there's a lot to like in this book. Especially when you're trying to figure out what's going on with the gray caps. The last thing I'd say is when I first started reading the omnibus version, which is over 800 pages, I noticed that the first book had been cut considerably, which I was really frustrated by. I don't like abridged versions, and I didn't like that it didn't specifically state at the outset that this book had been abridged. I had to find it on the fantasy Reddit. But I did track down an original version of City of Saints and Madmen, and I gotta say, you're really not missing much from my perspective with those cuts. The cuts are mostly to I don't remember what he calls it, but it's like the appendixes, essentially. And Vandermeer's is extra. He's doing things like giving you a story about the squid that are part of Ambergris' ecosystem, and most of the narrative is presented through an annotated bibliography from the guy who wrote it. And I'm just like, I can do without this. I can also do without 8 pages of love letters to the fonts you used in each of these stories and synesthetic details about what the fonts evoke. Like, after 846 pages, I'm good. So, I did go out of my way to try and read it because I am a completionist, but I really don't think you're missing a whole lot in reading the omnibus edition as opposed to each book separately. And the cover's so pretty. You'd be missing out on that. So if you like climate fiction or, naturalism, if you like a little bit of horror, nothing too like gross, but just weird, I think this book is a good one for you if you're willing to put in the time. So those were my 2 mammoths that I read in the month of March. So thanks to the creators, who I will link below, for creating the concept of March of the Mammoths. I will definitely be probably doing this again to help me get some of those tomes off my shelf. And I will talk to y'all soon. I think my next video, I'm going to try and do the feminist sci-fi and fantasy series that I love best. It's kind of a bigger lift video, but I hope that you will subscribe and like, and then you will see that video when it comes out. Thanks so much for watching.